Greetings, welcome. I am so excited to have you here to tune in to this virtual conversation that I am moderating with my good friends and colleagues, Stacy Malkin from US Right to Know and Kendra Klein from Friends of the Earth. In this conversation, we're going to be sharing with all of you some high-level reflections on our report, Merchants of Poison, how Monsanto sold the world on a toxic pesticide, a case study on disinformation, corrupted science, and manufactured doubt about glyphosate. While I am pulling up my screen here, can everybody see that?
Yeah,
great. So the report we're talking about today was reported, as I said, by Stacy Malkin at US Right to Know in collaboration with Kendra Klein from Friends of the Earth and myself at Real Food Media. And in the report, we uncover the disinformation strategies that allow pesticide companies like Bayer, which recently purchased Monsanto, to keep profiting off of toxic products, even while evidence mounts that these chemicals are costing people their lives, damaging children's health, threatening biodiversity and endangered species, and so much more. So one of the key messages of our work and of this report is that very much like big oil and big tobacco, these industries that more and more of us understand have really tried to shape the public understanding about their sectors, have really tried to, in some cases, really successfully influence regulation about their products and their industries, that the pesticide industry has also done the same thing, using many of the same tactics, many of the same people and organizations, spreading disinformation about their products and their sector to try to prevent government regulation. So over the next hour, we're excited to share with you some of the key messages that we highlight in this report, where we really do a deep dive on these themes about one particular pesticide, the herbicide known as glyphosate, or herbicides that have used the chemical glyphosate. It is the most widely used weed killer in the world. If you're tuning into this, you might already be familiar with that fact. And as we will discover in our conversation today, there are serious concerns about its impact on ecosystems and public health. So I am going to take a few more minutes to kind of set the stage for this report and this broader conversation about industry disinformation and what we could do about it. And then I will turn it over to Kendra, who will tell us more about the fundamental concerns that we all should have about pesticides, what we know about pesticide impacts on our health and the environment. And then I will be turning it over to Stacy, who will dive deeper into the findings of this case study, break down for you some of the key information strategies that we detail in this report. And then I will kind of pull it back up to the three of us and some closing remarks from the three of us. I wanted to start with these words from Edward Bernays, who is widely considered to be the father of public relations. He was actually the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he was really a genius at understanding how humans process information, what our motivations are, and how to harness what he knew about human nature for his corporate clients, which included the tobacco industry. Launching his career at the turn of the last century, he really developed and innovated some of the very tactics that you hear us talk about today. And he wrote, "We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of." And we include this quote over this classic image of tobacco executives speaking to Congress in 1994, where they testified in an ongoing attempt to continue to sow doubt about their products and we bring this slide up and this image of these executives to really showcase this very long history of disinformation that we're talking about today. And to help really try to connect the dots between the disinformation from the pesticide industry and specifically the story you'll hear about Bayer and Monsanto and the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry as well. Because we think more and more of us can see very clearly the ways in which the fossil fuel industry has tried to deflect regulation for its sector and has known for a very long time about the hazards of their products. In fact, more and more research comes out all the time. And we know how important it is to bring this largely stealth public relations into the public eye And what we hope is that in doing so, we can be part of those who are trying to ensure that our public institutions actually represent the public interest and not just corporate profits. We know now, thanks to investigative journalism and findings of internal corporate documents made public through the discovery process and litigation, just how much companies within the fossil fuel sector and the tobacco sector have really thwarted the public's knowledge about the grievous harms of their industry. And now we have that kind of evidence for the pesticide industry as well. We know that what companies do is they try as much as possible to deflect attention away from their own contributions to the crises their products are connected to, whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's the public health crisis from tobacco, or whether it's the kind of impacts that you'll hear from the pesticide industry, to stall action and to really limit the extent to which their industries are regulated. There's this really famous quote from public relations executives working with the tobacco industry who wrote, "Doubt is our product. Since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public, it is also the means of establishing a controversy." This key insight from Reynolds Tobacco from decades ago is an insight that industry realizes it does not need to fully clear its record. It does not need to fully explain how they're not responsible for the impacts of their products to win. And by winning, we mean to deflect regulatory action. That sowing doubt, for instance, about the connections between cigarettes and human health harms or fossil fuel use and climate change, or as you'll hear from the pesticide industry and the impacts of their products, it is a really effective way to deflect action. So in this report, we talk about one of the key companies in the global pesticide industry that, and we showcase the ways in which, again, they're using many of the same tactics that the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry has used to, again, sow this doubt and to really slow progress on regulatory action, specifically in this case study on glyphosate. In order to understand this story, I wanted to just take the last few minutes here to just help you understand a little bit more about the pesticide industry, about this agricultural chemical market, so you understand a little bit more of the context of this story. So this industry, it's a growing industry. You can see from this slide how much the agrochemical market is growing. It's growing globally, but it's particularly taking off in certain regions. Over the past 30 years, South America alone saw a 234% increase in the amount of pesticides used. So certain regions are certainly seeing a much bigger spike than others, but we are seeing this as a growing sector. Like many sectors, it is highly, highly concentrated, where power rests in the hands of just a few companies. Economists will tell you that once more than about half of a market is controlled by 4 companies or fewer, that you really don't have a competitive market any longer. And we're certainly seeing that in the agrochemical sector, where you see consolidation across, again, just a handful of companies, consolidation that has really sped up in just the last couple of years. You heard me mention this already, but Bayer, the agrochemical company that we are focused on today, recently purchased Monsanto, again, a sign of this growing consolidation in the market. We also, again, this is another kind of snapshot of this increase in global pesticide use. We want to stress what is one of the key drivers of this increase in pesticide use. One of the key drivers in the growth of pesticide use has been the increase in just a few significant pesticides, including the one we're talking about today, which is glyphosate. You see on this slide incredible spike in growth from the mid-1990s to today. And the reason why this has been such a huge spike from that time is that you could really tie the growth of glyphosate use in the marketplace with the introduction of genetically modified crops. As I mentioned, you see the spike really starting in the mid-1990s, which was when genetically modified crops were first commercialized, first here in the United States and then around the world. And while now GMOs are grown in a number of countries globally, only a handful, including Canada, Argentina, Brazil, and the US, make up the majority of the world's planted genetically modified crops. And what you see is, again, this incredible spike of the growth of the use of glyphosate. I would say it's not only on to be used and tied with genetically modified crops, it's also used on some other crops, including on wheat, for instance, where it's used as a desiccant, which means it is used to dry out the crop before harvest. It's also used on public lands. But it's really, really specifically and mostly used with genetically modified crops that have been designed to resist the use of the herbicide glyphosate and other herbicides. So when we talk, as I said, about glyphosate, it's really important that we tie this in with genetically modified foods and genetically modified crops. And that since the introduction of GMOs commercialized, as I said, in the mid-1990s, crops have been genetically engineered to basically do one or two things, or to do them both. Either they've been genetically engineered to resist a weed killer, glyphosate being one, or they have been genetically modified to express an insecticide, again, or to do both of these things, to both express this insecticidal property or to resist herbicides. And as you can see from this graphic, this is the vast majority of what genetically modified crops have been engineered to do. So we really want to stress this, that these conversations about genetic engineering in agriculture and the impacts of pesticides, particularly herbicides, really need to be brought together. So what is it we hear from the pesticide industry about all of their products? So, pesticides include herbicides, they also include insecticides and fungicides and rodenticides and many different kinds of chemical products in agriculture. What do we hear from the industry? What is the messaging of their public relations that you'll hear us talk more about in this conversation? We really hear three key messages. Number one, we hear that we need these pesticides to feed the world, that without them, we couldn't feed today's population and certainly couldn't feed the world's population into the future. Secondly, we hear that they are perfectly safe, that you don't need to worry about them, whether you're a farmer using them, whether you're a consumer eating food that's been grown using these products, or whether you live in a community next to fields that have been doused in them, you don't need to worry. A third key message is that any critic who debates either of those two previous arguments is fundamentally anti-science. They're Luddites, they're not interested in progress, they're confused, they're ideological, they're activists. The image that you see underlying this key message is of one of the most esteemed scientists in the history of the United States, who wrote the seminal Silent Spring more than half a century ago, Rachel Carson. Even Rachel Carson was targeted by Monsanto and other chemical companies at the time she published Silent Spring to try to undermine her reputation, to try to, in effect, undermine the key messages of her book, Silent Spring. And you'll hear Stacy talk more about this key tactic, this attack your critics tactic. So before turning it over to Kendra, I wanted to just say a final few words, a little bit more about context setting. In a minute, Kendra will share some of the evidence that takes on the veracity of these first two claims, that we need pesticides to feed the world and that they are totally safe. In fact, she will underscore just how much evidence we have about the widespread harm from pesticide use and the ample alternatives. And she will share what we know about the really incredible impact on human health, ecosystem biodiversity, on climate, and more. And then Stacy will help us further decode that disinformation and the tactics, including but not limited to this attack your critics tactic, specifically in this case study that we did on glyphosate. And so as you listen to what Stacy will share, we like to think about public relations like an iceberg, where at the tippy top, you see what's above the surface, the most obvious forms of marketing, advertising that you see on television or that you hear on the radio. But it's really what's beneath the surface that we wanted to share in this report. We want to share with you all today. And it's what's beneath the surface that is so important to bring into light, that it's the kind of disinformation that we hear about how industry uses front groups, organizations that seem like they're independent, but actually paid for, tied to industry, about how industry uses third-party allies to really shape narratives about their sector, and really most most concerning to us, how industry shapes the very science on which regulatory action is based. So before turning it over to Kendra, I just want to finally share one final slide to really emphasize how the work that you'll hear Kendra and Stacy share next is really tied into what we're so excited to see as a growing body of work that really helps to tell this story about the disinformation from the pesticide industry and how it is so important to bring it all to light. So books like those from Stacy's former colleague, Carrie Gillum, her book Whitewash and Monsanto Papers have been such important additions to the field of knowledge. And of course, the fabulous book Merchants of Doubt, which our title of our report, Merchants of Poison, obviously pays homage to. And so really wanted to stress, how much we appreciate how this work really situates itself in this broader field of writing and research and reporting. And Stacy will get into more of that, but first I'll turn it over to Kendra now to talk about what it is we know about pesticides and their harms, how we know it, and how we can feel empowered to raise these questions and to expose this disinformation at work. Oh, wait, you're on mute, Kendra.
Okay.
Great.
Never had quite so much trouble.
No matter how many times we do these, there's always got to be a snafu.
Getting all the buttons in the right place. Thank you so much, Anna. I want to share a bit of the science, really detailing what's at stake for our health, for climate and biodiversity with pesticide use overall, and some specific information about glyphosate. And I want to start here with everybody thinking about what they have eaten today and just really considering that food is the environment that we eat, that becomes our bodies. We are made of iron from leafy greens and vitamin C from carrots, but as eaters of the modern industrial food system, we are also made of a whole host of pesticides. And so if I tested your body, anybody listening to this, I would find likely dozens of different pesticides. We are, in fact, born pre-polluted. This is a landmark study of infant umbilical cord blood that has been replicated many times, finding an average of 200 industrial compounds, including 21 different pesticides. We, until recently, didn't have the capacity to test for glyphosate in our bodies. Now that we do, the Centers for Disease Control came out with this data last year showing that glyphosate is found in at least 80% of US urine samples and 87% of the children that they tested. This is a chemical that is linked to cancer, to liver disease, to hormone disruption, meaning like 50 other pesticides, it can mimic, block, or scramble the hormone messages in our bodies, and that can lead to obesity, diabetes, cancer, other health problems. Glyphosate has been linked to disruption of the gut microbiome, to shortened pregnancy, to decreased sperm function. So this massive range of health problems, and we know that the majority of us are exposed to it. And glyphosate is just one of many very concerning pesticides that are commonly used in our food system and found on our food. So this is USDA data showing just pesticides that are found on apples. And you can see from that list of health harms that we are talking about chemicals that are very concerning. When we say neurotoxicity, we are talking about increasing children's risk of learning disabilities, reduced IQ, autism, and as we age, risk of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, developmental problems of infants in utero, and trouble with fertility and other reproductive problems. We know that our children face the highest risk. This is the former head of NIEHS in this peer-reviewed piece pointing out how much our regulations are failing to protect our health. Children, infants, and babies in utero are undergoing such rapid stages of development that infinitesimally small exposures to toxic chemicals can have major and lifetime impacts. To understand one major reason that our regulations are out of step with the latest science, we have to look at the fact that we are exposed to a toxic chemical of not just pesticides, but many industrial compounds, and that therefore these small exposures matter because cumulative exposures add up. Not only do very small exposures matter because of the latest science on hormone disruption, but also this cumulative exposure. And so I have pulled out or highlighted OP pesticides, organophosphate pesticides. These are highly neurotoxic, related to sarin gas, linked to some of those neurological problems that I mentioned earlier. So consider the fact that doctors will prescribe a drug like Ritalin to alter children's brains and behavior at levels similar to or lower than what an average child may be exposed to of these neurotoxic pesticides. So then we begin to understand why these small exposures really can have a significant impact on our health. Another indication of how out of step with the science United States EPA regulations are, we allow the use of 85 pesticides that have been banned or being phased out in other jurisdictions based on the science of their harms to human health, to pollinators, and to the environment. We know that farm workers and their communities are on the front lines of exposure and suffer far greater health impacts. Asthma, cancer, birth defects, a massive range of greater impacts. And that they are also directly poisoned, and that some 44% of farmers worldwide are poisoned by pesticides every year. We know that pesticides are driving biodiversity decline. So just focusing here on insects, although they're impacting birds and aquatic species and a whole range of biodiversity. But what you're seeing here is data on declines of insects in the past 10 years from a meta review of worldwide data, finding that total global insect population have declined by 41% in just the last decade. And the authors of this study have warned that unless we change the way we are producing food, insects as a whole will go down the path of extinction in a few decades. And the repercussions are catastrophic if that happens, because insects are the basis of ecosystem food webs. We know that pesticides contaminate water, from streams to rain to our drinking water. 100% of US streams have detectable levels of pesticides, and over half of those exceed benchmarks for harm to aquatic species. Pesticides are found in 100% of rain samples in agricultural regions, and glyphosate is found in 86% of rain samples across the United States. And I included that last point just so that we understand that the process of water treatment may not be able to protect us from the pesticides that show up in our drinking water. Finally, we know that pesticides harm soil ecosystems. So the top study is a meta review co-published by Friends of the Earth, finding that pesticides kill or harm soil invertebrates, so earthworms, beetles, ground nesting bees, in 71% of cases. And below, that's an analogous study of pesticides harm to soil microorganisms. And together, what these tell us is, as we get very excited about the possibilities to sequester carbon in the soil as a climate solution and as a way to conserve water resources, we need to understand that pesticides harm the very soil life that makes that possible. And so any discussion about regenerative agriculture needs to include the reduction of toxic pesticides. Farmers are not winning in this system. They are stuck on a pesticide treadmill. In fact, 90% of Iowa farmers report feeling pest management as a never-ending technology treadmill. And that's because pests and weeds rapidly develop resistance to chemicals that are used ubiquitously across many acres and year after year. And so farmers are stuck then using more and more toxic chemicals to deal with those resistant pests and weeds. Glyphosate is a case in point. As Anna was describing, the use of genetically engineered Roundup ready crops has led to super weeds on over 150 million acres in the United States. And so what we see is from 2002 to 2020, use of the number of different herbicides doubled, and the pounds of herbicides applied doubled. And so very clearly, the use of this technology is driving us much deeper into this treadmill, into the trench of pesticide intensiveness. And just to highlight this, the use of 2,4-D, which you may know as one of the components of Agent Orange, the Vietnam War defoliant, has increased 19 times in the past decade in the Midwest. We are turning to antiquated, known hazardous chemicals because we are stuck on this treadmill. Unfortunately, climate change is set to exacerbate this vicious cycle. This is from a report from Pesticide Action Network. And that's because the warming temperatures are going to change the ranges in which certain pests thrive. And they're also going to decrease plants' capacity to resist pests, their immunity, which will drive an increase in pesticide use, which will further undermine the soil health. We know that healthy plants grow from healthy soil. And so, we can see where we are headed. So how do we get off this treadmill? The very good news is we have solutions. We have decades of science, in fact, telling us that these ecological approaches to farming that work with nature can manage pests with few or no toxic pesticides. So building diversity into the system, intercropping and rotating crops to disrupt pest cycles, planting trap crops at the edge of fields to draw pests away, mulching and other practices that build those healthy soils that grow healthy plants that can resist pest pressures. There's so many approaches that can help us really get off the sort of war with nature chemical track and work with the agricultural ecosystems. I pulled just a few studies just to indicate there are a large and growing body of data that show us that farmers who use ecological methods can have lower pest pressure, can outperform growers using pesticides in terms of their production and profitability. They are fostering the natural predators of pests, and in many other ways seeing the benefits of agroecological farming. It's important to understand that organic is the gold standard for ecological farming and pesticide reduction. And that is because by law, organic farmers are only allowed to use 25 least toxic, most biodegradable synthetic pesticides. Meanwhile, over 900 different pesticides are allowed in conventional agriculture. And there's no other label or standard backed by federal law like this, and actually backed by international law. There's harmony across all countries when you see that organic label, that it is meaningful. We know that from data looking at human exposure to pesticides. So this is a peer-reviewed study co-authored by Friends of the Earth that found after just 1 week of switching families to an organic diet, their exposure to pesticides dropped dramatically. This has been replicated by many other studies, both indicating we have many pesticides in our bodies on a conventional diet, and we can rapidly reduce those exposures on an organic diet. Organic works. A companion study looked at glyphosate and found that in 1 week on an organic diet, glyphosate dropped 70%. So what we are talking about is really a human right to food that is not grown with toxic pesticides, that doesn't contain residues of toxic pesticides. All eaters have that right. And we can envision a food system in which that is true. Farmers and farm workers have the right to not be exposed day in and day out to toxic chemicals to grow the food we eat. And the way we grow food should support the ecosystems that sustain all life rather than harm them. And I've presented this data on human exposure, but there's also mountains of data showing that organic production systems can have benefits for soil, for pollinators, for water. This is, in fact, expert consensus, represented here just by a number of reports. But really, when you look at the literature, when you look at scientific analysis, we do not need pesticides to feed the world. In fact, it is the exact opposite, because pesticide-intensive agriculture is essentially sawing off the branch that we're sitting on. It's undermining the soil, the water, the climate resources that we need to grow food into the future. And so if we are going to sustainably feed generations to come, we need to rapidly transition towards agroecological methods. We need to farm in a way that, rather than destroying biodiversity, supports it, and that can help support a stable climate and ecosystem for our generations to come. So I will hand it to you, Stacy, to give us a deeper dive into the toxics of the pesticide industry.
Thank you, Kendra and Anna. I am so incredibly grateful to both of you for your work and for collaborating on this report. I am going to just dive right into the tactics that companies are using, the pesticide industry is using to hide and distract from and sow doubt about the information that Kendra just shared. And the findings I'm going to discuss today come from Monsanto's own document. So I wanted to speak for a minute about the source material that we used. We focused on glyphosate in our case study because, as mentioned, it's the world's most widely used herbicide and many health concerns. And it's also a topic about which we have a huge amount of source material that shine light on the corporate activities that were happening behind the scenes. So the two key sources we used for our case study were a public records investigation conducted by my group, US Right to Know. Over the years, we've been looking into how pesticide and processed food companies run their lobbying and PR campaigns. So we have many documents from those investigations, and we've donated a bunch of them to the UCSF Industry Documents Library. So you can go there into their searchable database and look up the documents that we found. And another source is the Monsanto papers, which are the many, many discovery documents released during the lawsuits against Monsanto. There are currently over 100,000 people have sued them with claims that exposure to glyphosate-based Roundup caused them to develop cancer. So as Anna mentioned, these documents have been very robustly covered in the media. There was a congressional investigation, a couple of academic reports, several books, including two by my former colleague, Carrie Gillum. And so very well covered by excellent reporting because, again, there's so much information that was revealed in these documents. What we felt that we could add on top of that was a deep dive into what the documents reveal about how Monsanto ran its product defense campaign for glyphosate, and it was quite extensive. And it's important to say that these are not just Monsanto tactics. The documents name all of the top pesticide firms as being involved in this campaign. And also we know from their own documents, Syngenta, Dow, DuPont, that they've run similar campaigns to deny science again and again and again. And you can really see that the entire industry is consolidated corruption, companies that have won their market by continuing to deny science and lie about the health harms of their products. And of course, these tactics parallel what we see with the tobacco and fossil fuel industries, as Anna said. And in some cases, they involve some of the same people, the same front groups, the same academics, and the same funding sources. So I'll talk a little bit about that. The tactics are aggressive, expensive, multifaceted, designed to sow doubt, create confusion, attack, and discredit critics. We remember how just horribly offensive the tobacco industry's campaigns were, as evidenced by this little baby. And, you know, I use that to say that the tactics that the pesticide industry is using are very much the same sort of aggressive, distressing tactics. And I really like this quote from Gary Kasparov: "The point of modern propaganda isn't only to misinform or push an agenda, it's to exhaust your critical thinking, to annihilate truth." So it's coming at us from all angles, and it can be hard to see. We focused in the case study on 5 specific tactics that are very clear in the documents, and those were methods they used to corrupt the science, co-opting professors and universities for industry PR purposes, deploying a huge range of third parties who seem independent, but they are not, fomenting attacks against scientists, journalists, and many others, and also weaponizing the web and using social media tools in many ways to push their messaging. So I'll jump right into corrupting the science. It's not an exaggeration to say that in the product defense model, the investigator starts with an answer, then figures out the best way to support it. That's a quote from David Michael's book, who really does an excellent job of showing how these tactics are used by many industries and also have become more and more aggressive over the years. So in the science denial category, we see many tactics in the Monsanto documents, and there are quotes on the left here from their documents and showing how Monsanto scientists would discuss vulnerabilities in the science and how ways they could address those to portray the products as safe. And so the tactics they use involve ghostwriting, where a company employees write or contribute studies in ways they don't disclose, hiding conflicts of interest, not following evidence of harm, trying to stop independent research, handpicking friendly scientists to get particular results, creating studies to support particular PR narratives. So the PR narrative first, and then talking about ways they can create data to support that. And then submitting subpar, very shoddy science to regulatory agencies. And that's a really important point, because Bayer's main defense for glyphosate is that EPA and EU regulatory authorities say it's safe, so it's fine. But unfortunately, we know that regulatory agencies are not using the best science. And in fact, there was a recent analysis at the University of Vienna that looked at 53 studies submitted by industry to the EU for glyphosate approval, and only 2 of them can be assessed as scientifically reliable, only 2 out of 53. And none of them included the best methods to detect cancer. So this was well put in a Bloomberg article by Mark Buchanan, who's the former editor of Nature Journal. And he points out that modern science is making it harder for chemical companies to hide the mounting evidence of harm. And as the epidemiologist Pete Myers said, regulatory agencies use science out of the Jurassic. And if they used modern science, that would be an existential threat to the chemical industry as we know it. So the science, to begin with, is manipulated for decades. Secondly, another very effective tactic that the pesticide industry uses, and in a way, I think this makes them more effective than some of the campaigns run by tobacco and fossil fuel, because they really have the side of academia on their side. And one of the big reasons for that is because land grant universities that are doing agricultural research and development very heavily depend on corporate funding. And this has gotten worse over the years, as shown in this study, how public funding has increased a little bit while corporate funding has just skyrocketed. So we see that academics and universities were a major help to the pesticide industry, to Monsanto, when it came time to defend glyphosate and also to fight GMO labeling and to promote GMOs. So these are just a few of the things that we discuss in our report that coming from the documents. So we see that the University of Florida received major funding from pesticide companies, over $10 million for the year 2013-14. It was not publicly disclosed. These slides at the bottom here from the foundation website actually were online for a short time. We captured them online, gave them to the New York Times, but they disappeared from online. And people from the University of Florida are on record saying we don't take any money from these companies. So there's a lot of deception about the funding. We also see from the documents that Monsanto was working with professors directly, in some cases offering them funds to do product promotions for GMOs and pesticides. We see from the emails that the university saw themselves as helpers and aides for promoting GMOs. So this is an email from a university leader to Monsanto's Rob Fraley, and it discusses how they have harmonious messaging with Monsanto. They have a lead spokesperson at the university on GMOs. He was also very active in defending glyphosate. And as Anna and Kendra mentioned, the two go hand in hand. His job was educating the masses about the benefits of GMOs and pesticides. And together they are ramping up their efforts to spread the good word. So this is really sounding like the university as a PR agent for products, rather than a neutral party. But of course, the public really sees them as credible and trustworthy, and this is why the industry relies on them so heavily. University of Florida also hosted, along with UC Davis, a 3-day boot camp called the Biotech Literacy Project, which actually brought together reporters and scientists to train them in industry talking points and methods for lobbying and promoting GMOs and pesticides. So this is really concerning. And of course, universities are only one of the third parties that companies rely on to spread their messaging. In Tactic 3, we take a closer look at this wide range of groups that are spreading Monsanto's messaging. As this PR executive from Porto Novelli, Merrill Rose, put it, the third party tactic is put your words in somebody else's mouth. And the pesticide companies rely on many, many, many others to spread their messaging for them. We see on this slide at the top is Monsanto's PR campaign to defend glyphosate against the cancer report that came out from the International Agency for Research on Cancer. In 2015, IARC is the cancer research agency of the World Health Organization. And we see from the documents that Monsanto was planning to rebut this report before it even came out. And so they had their messaging laid out. They would orchestrate outcry and outrage against the science panel. They would describe their science as agenda-driven. And they had a lot of partners that they would rely on to do it. So in this document at the top, it says inform, inoculate, and engage industry partners. And it goes through 4 tiers of partners that I think are really helpful to look at to understand the scope of this. And the first tier are the trade associations. These are large, well-funded groups funded by industry whose job it is to protect products. Pretty well known by most to be funded by industry, so they're transparent about that. In the second tier, we see front groups. And so these are groups that are not so transparent about their connections to industry. Groups that sound sciencey, but really have an agenda to defend products for companies that pay them. In tier 3 is basically the entire processed food industry, some very large, well-funded groups that are going to work on educating the food companies about their science-based studies versus the agenda-driven studies of the IARC panel. And then tier 4, growers associations, those are groups that grow corn, soy, have huge budgets, sometimes in the tens of millions or even hundreds of millions in some cases, and some of it taxpayer funded, who use some of that money for PR to defend those products. So it's a very large, varied group. And we looked at the groups that were specifically named in Monsanto documents for glyphosate defense. And that was this document and 2 others. And we analyzed the budgets of those groups. You can see that on the slide here. Lots of money going to these groups, tens of millions a year being spent on front groups, and a total of 1.4 billion over 5 years on not just glyphosate defense, but other product defense too, and many strategies to confuse, sow doubt, and spread the message, as Kendra said, that we need this system to feed the world when the science shows actually that we don't. So they have to rely on a lot of people to spread those messages, because people tend not to trust the companies. I want to mention, before I move on from this tactic, the AstroTurf operations. This was a huge one. AstroTurfing is a fake grassroots effort run by PR firms, but designed to look like it's a spontaneous uprising of regular people. This one was called Freedom to Farm, and it was created to look like farmers across Europe demanding that the government not regulate glyphosate. But just to give an idea of the firepower at work here, this document talks about 39 full-time equivalent employees from public relations firms and 56 trained operatives in the field, spread across many European countries to run this operation of looking like farmers. They talk in the documents about creating fake grassroots looking websites. And we see here, though, it's actually run by PR firms Fleischmann Hillard. And we write about the PR firms in the report, Fleischmann Hillard, as well as Ketchum, FTI Strategies, FTI Consulting, Lincoln Strategies. Those are some of the names. And all of them, besides working for pesticide companies, also have histories of working with tobacco and fossil fuel companies on these kinds of underhanded tactics. Number 4 strategy that we looked at, and one of the major ones that came into play to try to fight the World Health Organization's cancer panel, was this strategy of attacking scientists, journalists, also public health advocates. There's really clear evidence of the companies closely tracking what all of us, and what anybody who is a critic of the pesticide industry is saying, and coming up with strategies to deflect and discredit. I'm going to focus here on the scientists' attack, because it was really quite unprecedented and dramatic when it came to Monsanto feeling so cornered that it had to make a full frontal attack on the IARC cancer panel. And this is a quote from Le Monde journalist, which is the biggest paper in France, and it was they won a big award for the series they did on the Monsanto papers, and they described it as an effort to destroy the United Nations Cancer Agency by any means possible. Here in the American Journal of Public Health, the dean of the School of Colorado Public Health, Jonathan Samet, describes it as an unprecedented and harsh strategies like those used by the tobacco and others, but notable for its intensity and reach, and also its impact on the IARC working groups. And they did go directly for the scientists who worked on the IARC glyphosate review. And he said it really amounted to expert review itself coming under attack. And I think this is important to note for the rising intensity. And again, that idea that modern science is really such a threat to these companies that they're ratcheting up the tactics to fight the science. I'm just going to run through these slides quickly, but here you could see very clearly how they work with front groups, Monsanto reaching out to this group, the American Council on Science and Health, and asking them to defend glyphosate against IARC. And you see here the Monsanto executives discussing how much prolific output comes from this group writing content for product defense. So 2 books, a pamphlet, they're extremely helpful. Their pesticide review, 53 recent posts, and that's not all, there were many more. So they talk about how valuable that group was to their product defense efforts. But the group claims it's independent, sometimes gets quoted in the media, and often shows up at the top of Google News searches. The Genetic Literacy Project is another group very key to Monsanto's efforts to attack IARC. I won't go into them, but they are linked to the American Council on Science and Health, and I have fact sheets on both groups on our website and the URLs on these slides. If you search their website, over 200 articles come up critical of IARC and the scientists who worked on glyphosate. And here's just an example of the attack language. They talk about the scientists are rife with corruption, distortion, and fraud. They're in it for personal profit and ideological vanity. And these are volunteers, by the way, that work on the IARC reports. But here they are accusing them of lying to Congress, excluding information, corruption, and secrecy. And the articles, as you can see, are written by climate science denialists, former chemical industry lobbyists, the other front group. It's really just nasty attacks. And the funders of this group they are disclosing Bayer funding. And their long-term funders are these right-wing foundations, SCAFE, Civil Freedom Trust, Templeton Foundation, that have also been written about as leading funders of the climate science denial network. So we have here groups saying they stand for science, claiming to be independent as they attack scientists. So we tried to call that out and shine light on it. Unfortunately, these groups have quite a lot of partnerships that give them legitimacy. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The last tactic here I want to talk about is how companies are using strategies to weaponize the web and really gin up attacks on critics and a controversy where there isn't controversy, where the science is actually against them. This is a quote from Jay Byrne, who was Monsanto's former director of communications. Think of the internet as a weapon on the table. Either you pick it up or your competitor does, but somebody's going to get killed. So that's kind of the philosophy. And this was a quote from 20 years ago in The Guardian. And Jay Byrne is still key to Monsanto's product defense efforts. And we write a lot about that in the report, but these are just some of the ways that these groups rise up to the surface of our consciousness about the public conversation about chemicals. This on the left, we see a Google News search for pesticides in food showed up with Genetic Literacy Project, the group that viciously attacks scientists, not just first and second, but first, second, third, fourth, and fifth of the top 5 Google News search returns. And this kind of result was repeated over and over and over. I did it many times over years, looking at this group and also the American Council on Science and Health and their other science websites. And they are often showing up at the top of a Google News search for topics of importance to the pesticide industry. We also have many GMO trolls. People, if anybody's ever been outspoken on this topic, maybe you've gotten attacked by many, many trolls. Here we have Marian Nessel, who's a reporter, a professor at New York University, talking about how she had to turn off comments on her blog because she criticized an industry-friendly documentary and got 870 comments just suddenly filed in response to her post. She writes, I realize that this sort of thing is a deliberate, if shameful, strategy of the ag biotech industry. Let nothing go. So they had a let nothing go project is what Monsanto called it. And they really were closely tracking influencers and sending trolls, sending academics, trying to criticize, discredit, silence, and get people to stop talking. Unfortunately, though, these groups, as I said, have some powerful partnerships, including, as mentioned earlier, with universities. Genetic Literacy Project was also behind those boot camps at University of Florida and UC Davis. And here they had a partnership with the US government, or at least discussions about one, where Genetic Literacy Project and Jay Byrne, Monsanto's former comms director, would run a series of projects to share messaging with the help of the US government to promote and defend GMOs and pesticides. And the email shows a fellow from USDA saying, yeah, your efforts and ours intersect well. So it's really concerning that these groups do have legitimacy, even though when you look at their own words and their own strategies, they very much are discreditable. And so that's why I think it's really important to shine light on them, to know who these groups are. And we've been tracking the main people and groups that do product defense for pesticide companies at US Right to Know with a series of fact sheets. So each one explaining industry connections, what the documents show, the kinds of projects they were involved in. So that's helpful for those who want to understand the front groups that work behind the scenes, and also the friendly professors. I want to end with a quote from Nassim Taleb. He's a well-known risk analyst, best-selling author, mathematical statistician. He was attacked by the GMO trolls because he wrote an academic article on the systemic risks of GMOs, which is an excellent article. We cite it in our report. So he says, unlike the mafia with tentacles, corporations are monstrously fragile. The fact that they need so much lobbying and spinning indicates just how fragile they are. So I think that's important to keep in mind, as this can be overwhelming, but the truth will come through in the end, and shining light on the tactics that they use is one piece of that. We do talk about ways that we can confront pesticide industry science denial and disinformation, and we have a post up on that in this link, so you can check out our recommendations. But just things like understanding and exposing the PR strategies, really knowing who the groups are and what they're up to, bolstering the integrity of scientific journals and really holding them to account for conflict of interest disclosure policies that are not always followed, and getting better policies in place. Same with journalists, holding them to account to identify front groups, not use front groups, vet their sources, and understand where information is coming from. Challenge and expose corporate influence at universities, and we have a wonderful how-to guide for students who want to understand corporate funding at your university, and how to find out about that, and how to find out what might be promised to these companies in return. Holding public relations professionals accountable, and supporting independent investigative journalism. So with that, I just want to say there's a lot we can do, and just understanding and speaking out in our communities, and really being in touch with journalists, being in touch with scientific journals, finding out what's happening at universities and challenging the narratives that are untrue is a really important piece, not just of holding the pesticide industry accountable, but to creating a livable future for our children. And I think Kendra's presentation did such an amazing job of showing us what's at stake and why this is all so important. So thank you again so much, Anna and Kendra, and everyone working on these issues. And yeah, let's just share the truth, and please share our report and our fact sheets, and sign up for our newsletter. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Stacy. And I thought I'd bring you back into the conversation, Kendra, if you wanted to close us out with any final thoughts about some of the other things that we can do. Stacy, you talked about some of that in the last few minutes, but Kendra, I wanted to bring you back into the conversation. Did you want to add anything else about, this does feel so overwhelming, hearing both of your presentations, even as someone who works very intimately on these issues and helped in this report, it always washes over me again with such a sense of frustration that we haven't moved the needle farther on regulation, that we are still in the place we are. And yet I know that it is work like this that is going to keep us moving forward. But Kendra, did you want to add anything else about kind of what we each can do individually and collectively?
Yeah, I think that one of the most powerful things we can do is to not let them annihilate our willingness and our ability to believe that a different future is possible, to understand that it really has only been a matter of decades that this very pesticide intensive food system has developed. And so being willing to envision decades down the line that we will have a completely different food system, because unless we believe it's possible, we cannot work to make it happen. And I think that there are ways that we can each tap into who we are and what most motivates us, Certainly as individuals, if you have the ability to buy organic, to do that when you can, because that is a daily way to support farmers who are truly changing the food system, and a way to send a message to the food industry that this is where the growth is. And we are already seeing that it continues to grow and grow and grow every year. If you are a teacher or professor, consider the ways that you can help educate your students to really understand the science and the possibility of a different future and inspire them to work towards it. If you are a journalist, do not be hooked. Understand who these mouthpieces are, who appears to be credible, but really is backed by the pesticide industry. And if you are engaged in politics in any way, locally or state or nationally, to use that position and that power to help make change. And all of us need to make our voices heard to our elected officials to ensure that they understand that this is a critical issue. And I think that, we have seen this powerful movement around climate and climate change, and to really lift up the fact that we are being poisoned for profit as another absolutely critical crisis that we and the world are facing. So thank you all.
Thanks, Kendra. And thank you all for tuning in, for listening or watching. And for those who want to stay connected with our work, as Stacy said, you can go to her organization's website, US Right to Know, at usrtk.org. Kendra Klein is with Friends of the Earth. Their website is foe.org. And Real Food Media you can find at realfoodmedia.org. And all of our organizations have huge amount of resources and ways to stay connected on this work and to take action. So we encourage you to check out our work in those three organizations' websites. And then to find our report, Merchants of Poison, you can go to bit.ly/Merchants of Poison, capital M, capital P. And we look forward to hearing from you, hearing what you think about this work and what you think about the report and how you are engaging in this work. Kendra, Stacy, always so wonderful to connect with you and to hear your words of wisdom. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you both.